Okay, we're ready to get started. Our next presentation is by Masashi Nishihata and John Scott Railton from Citizens Lab. Please welcome them to the stage.
Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm Masashi Nishihata. This is John Scott Railton. We're from the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. And what we want to talk to you about today is targeted threats affecting civil society, what's happening to them, and what we can do. And we're going to give that to you in 4 different ways. We're going to tell you a good story to set the stage and the context. Then we're going to give you an analogy to zoom out and try to better understand the situation that civil society is in when it comes to information security threats. Then we're going to present some evidence from cases that we have done, and then discuss the ongoing challenges that civil society faces and what the security industry and what the colleagues in the room today could do to help improve. So I'll pass it off now to John for the story.
We just discovered that it looks like the font has been converted on our presentation, so we're going to have all kinds of fun Easter eggs here somewhere in the process. So it'll be a discovery for me too. All right, meet Omar. Omar lives a few hundred miles from where we're sitting right now in Quebec. He's a university student. He is also a critic of Saudi Arabia. Omar came to Canada and became critical of the Saudi government's human rights record quite vocally, and has amassed a substantial following on YouTube saying his criticisms. More recently, though, Omar, under pressure from the Saudi government, requested and received asylum in Canada and is today a Canadian permanent resident. Not too long ago this summer, Omar ordered a large tub of delicious protein. And shortly after ordering it, received a text message on his pants computer with shipment tracking information. It actually was not shipment tracking information. This was a malicious SMS confirmed by my colleague Bill Marzak, who led this research. In fact, this was malware. This was NSO's Pegasus. So people mentioned Pegasus in the last talk. Philip evoked it. This is basically a sophisticated piece of government-exclusive spyware that can take control of a device. It has a bunch of neat anti-forensics features, a lot of other cool stuff. Oh man, this font's going to be amazing. It's developed by NSO Group, which pitches itself as an Israeli cyber warfare company and is owned by a San Francisco-based private equity firm. And if the animations on this are borked, this is going to be really interesting. Back in 2016, my colleagues and I first discovered NSO's Pegasus in the wild being used to target a dissident named Ahmed Mansoor, who is a human rights defender based in the United Arab Emirates and was highly critical of his government. Mansoor received text messages as well, equally malicious, these ones promising secrets on Emiratis tortured in state prisons, which was a topic of his advocacy. But in fact, those contained NSO. We worked with Mansoor and with Lookout and Apple and determined that the malware that was targeting him used a chain of 3 zero-day vulnerabilities to infect devices. In 2017, we continued investigating NSO and determined that the Mexican NSO operator had massively targeted Mexican civil society with this exclusive piece of kit. Media, law, public health, government, anti-corruption, even investigators of mass killings. So fast forward to 2018, work led by my colleague Bill used a really cool technique, DNS cache probing, as well as global scanning, to come up with a map of countries where at least one NSO Pegasus victim was located. And we get a map that looks like this. So a lot of countries with people whose devices have been targeted with Pegasus. More recently, in a report published on Monday, one of the Pegasus customers, one of the NSO customers that we found, had a series of infections in a bunch of different countries, including Canada. So drilling into that, the Canadian infection had an interesting property, which is it bounced between two networks. So it bounced between Videotron, which is a Quebecois network, and RISC, which is an academic network that provides services to universities in Quebec. So we had an infection that would show up in one network, beacon there, disappear, show up again on the RISC network. And the question was, would it be possible to identify a victim just based on this weird pattern of life? And the answer is, yes, it was. Here's Omar. So Omar had a daily routine of activity, passing from home to university campus for an evening activity that exactly matched the pattern of life of the infection that we observed, which allowed us to conclude that Omar had been successfully targeted with NSO's Pegasus. And on Monday, we released a fun little report, The Kingdom Came to Canada, which I encourage you all to read, which lays out exactly the methodology that we used for this finding. I don't want to talk too much about this in any great detail because this is the work primarily of Bill, who's going to do a full presentation on this at a later time. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to Masashi.
So thanks, John. So from that story, let's zoom out now and look at the wider context of digital espionage operations affecting civil society. And what I'm going to do is build out an analogy to help us understand the situation that they're in. So this is a figure from a SecureWorks report published in 2017, and it shows the distribution of targets for an APT28 linked operation. So what you can see here is amongst the targets, a third are civil society, represented here by journalists, non-governmental organizations, and political activists. And while you might see references like this to civil society and industry reports, it is very rare to have any detail on why they were targeted, what the impact of the targeting may be, and how their defenses and experiences may differ from industry and government. This is a figure from some of our own reporting, also on a different APT28 linked operation. And in this case, again, we see a roughly comparable targeting of civil society when you compare that to industry, military, and government. In this case, civil society means academics, activists, journalists, and others. So what is it really that we're looking at here? Well, we have the same threat actor, in this case APT28, targeting a range of organizations from different sectors, be it government, military, private sector, and civil society. What makes civil society different? Well, they are much, much softer targets than these other types of groups. Now, why is that the case? That points to an inherent asymmetry in information security that civil society finds itself dealing with. It is cheap to connect, but it's expensive to secure. So what does that mean in practical terms for your average non-governmental organization group? Well, what that means is that you're running what you could consider your ultimate bring your own device environment. So for many of these groups, there is no IT department, or there might be very, very limited staff with a mix of technical skills at best. These groups in general have limited resources and time. They have little access to user and staff behavior to better understand how threats are getting into the organization, and often have very poor documentation of the systems that they're using. So what are the consequences of being in this kind of environment? Well, here's the analogy. Let's think about this in the context of public health. So where there is no working health system, all kinds of preventable and curable infections can become catastrophic for a population. So let's just further illustrate this. This figure here is showing the number of deaths due to infectious diseases around the world over a time span of the last 200 years. So you see the biggest circle is tuberculosis with 1 billion deaths, and then it goes down for other types of diseases. Tuberculosis, of course, is a preventable and curable disease, but despite that, remains one of the deadliest diseases in the world, and each year kills 1 million or more people on average. So let's compare that to something like Ebola. Ebola, of course, there is no cure. It is a terrifying disease. It can have devastating effects on a population. But when you look at the impact, we're seeing a bit over 11,000 deaths, and you're comparing that to 1 billion. So, of course, researching something like Ebola could be very exciting. It's important work. There's a lot of open questions, and it's a scary thing. Let's think about this in the context of our industry. Ebola is the 0 days. Ebola is the new exotic commercial malware. Ebola is the interesting, fun stuff that you want to come to conferences like this and hear about, and that you want to hack on, and that you want to be, the first company or researcher to have a report around. And I understand that. That makes sense. Sometimes we see Ebola too affecting civil society, like in the story that John gave. But that's not what's affecting people every day, and that's not where the real harm is coming from. The real harm is coming from your tuberculosis, your smallpox, your malaria of malware. These are preventable, curable, and kind of technically boring maybe for people that are looking at these all the time, but this is where the real harm comes from. So for civil society, what has this meant? Civil society is massively targeted by digital espionage operations. These threats are technically boring, but they're also preventable. And why is this happening? Well, it's because these threats are effective. So from this kind of abstract analogy, I want to walk you through some evidence from our cases to give you a better picture of what these boring threats look like. So here's an example. Our font looked cooler before, I swear. That we see all the time, and that's remote access Trojans and old day exploits. So not your 0 days, but old, crusty, boring exploits. Typically, these kinds of threats, which I'm sure everybody in the room is very familiar with, are delivered to groups through email vectors with an enticing message asking you to click on a document or other type of file or link, which is laden with malware. So these types of threats present a minimal barrier to entry for operators, and typically what we're seeing is very, very low technical sophistication. So what this means is it really levels the playing field for digital espionage. Anyone now can do it, and trust me, everybody is. And the calculus for the operator is simple. If your target clicks on it, you own them. And boy, do they click on it. The consistent finding for social engineering is that 40 to 60% of people are tricked by spear phishing. And this is how they're getting into civil society groups. This is how they are penetrating movements. This is how they are compromising individuals. Here's an example. In 2014, we published a report called Communities at Risk, which documented investigations that we did with 10 civil society organizations over 4 years. Many of these groups were conducting human rights activities around issues in China, such as the Tibetan movement. Other groups were large international groups who work on a number of issues. Over that period of time, we collected over 2,000 pieces of malware from 44 different malware families. So these were highly targeted groups. But really what we were seeing was a lot of old days. And think about this from an operator perspective. These are soft targets. Don't burn a 0 day if you don't need to. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Over this 4-year period, we found 1 0 day, but most of what we're seeing were pretty old and crusty. The most common CVEs were 2010 3333 and 2012 0158. If anyone in the room investigates APT-style operations in Asia, I'm sure you're very familiar with these exploits. So let's get into a bit of detail. In this graph, on one axis, you see CVEs, and on the bottom there, you see time. The orange dots represent when an email was received from a group, so that's basically the time of the intrusion attempt. And the gray lines represent when that CVE was publicly announced. So you see these two blobs, that's 2010 3333 and 2012 0158. And these were the most common exploits that we saw. Importantly, 2012-0158 was patched since April 10th, 2012, but you can see, might be a little bit hard to see on the scale here, but way past the patch date, this was continued to be used for years. This is how these operations were being conducted. Here you see our 1.0 day, which was a flash exploit, and you can see the orange dot is occurring before the public announcement of the exploit. So again, don't burn something if you don't need to when you're going after a soft target is the mentality of these operators. So that was from 2014. You might ask, well, what has changed? And the answer for these groups is not very much. So we continue to work with many of those groups from that report, and we've been working with groups in the Tibetan diaspora and wider movement for many, many years. So for these groups, they're still receiving mostly old days, crusty exploits. We've seen a bit of refreshment for this, a little bit of change from the operators, but still mostly the same. We even still see 2012-0158 used to this day. Most of this malware is custom kit, but we are gradually also seeing the use of some commodity rats. So this is the context for these particular communities, but what about when these kinds of operations are happening within an armed conflict? And for that, I'm going to pass it on to John.
All right, so everybody hacks during a war. One of the cool things about looking at hacking and information operations during a conflict is because there's so many sides motivated to see stuff, you see all kinds of interesting things. Now, there was a glorious animation here. We'll see how this plays out. So we spent a lot of years looking at the different actors playing in the Syrian space. Here's a little overview. You have Syrian malware teams, the Syrian Electronic Army. They're busily targeting Syrian opposition groups with malware, phishing, crummy Android malware. They're also conducting sort of side hustles, doing criminal activity, a little bit of sort of basic blackmail against foreign targets who they're going after. Then Assad regime actors are also targeting ISIS and other Islamist groups that they're in physical war with. Clicker, clicker, clicker. All right. Meanwhile, Islamist groups have done some sort of lightweight targeting of the opposition groups that they've been fighting with. And then you have Iranian groups, Lebanese groups, and Russian groups all targeting the Syrian opposition. And finally, you have the Syrian opposition doing some kind of crummy lightweight targeting of the regime, as well as, because these things are really fractious, targeting itself, right? So everybody is hacking. It's really kind of like a spaghetti soup of bad stuff, right? And then you have sort of more sophisticated stuff. We're a little short on our time frame here, and this is almost illegible. So I'll basically tell you there are lots of groups. A common theme among many of these groups is really bottom barrel sophistication. This is the sort of like my cousin knows computers approach to network intrusion and monitoring. The thing is, it still works, right? And it works because most of the people who are now operating in sort of high-risk environments brought with them their devices, their contact lists, their accounts, their communication strategies. None of those things were designed to be hardened. And I would submit that that's kind of a feature of social movements and change today, which is you have no idea who next year's belligerents or activists or others are going to be. But what you can say with some certainty is when social disruption happens, they're going to go into it with whatever technology they're using. So it's a great opportunity to see the kind of security limitations and the models of kind of mass market tech. And everybody's hacking. All right, so what does that look like in practice? Here's some work I did in collaboration with Nart Villeneuve and Dan Regalado of FireEye. This is an awesome report called Behind the Syrian Conflict's Digital Frontlines. So here's a transcript of an interaction, a Skype conversation between a victim, well, at this moment, still a target, and a Lebanese operator who I think we could say is very likely linked to Hezbollah. So the operator, masquerading as this attractive woman, asks in a Skype conversation, it's lonely when you're fighting a war. There's a lot of like unused time, right? And people are just sitting around on laptops, right? They've got their satellite internet connection and it's boring. And one of the biggest problems in a conflict is how are you going to find the person to get married to? Right? Like, everybody's growing up. And so there's this fair amount of, kind of like blind dates online. So into this mix, tumbles this interaction, right? Are you operating on Skype or on your mobile? The target responds, right? Computer and mobile, helpfully. How old are you? 25, says our charming avatar, and you. What's your date of birth, says the target, perhaps a little bit suspiciously. 10-3-88, says our operator. Wow, says the target, my God, 10-3-89, right? Obviously, the operator had some knowledge of who the target was going into this. What a nice coincidence, says our operator. Here's a picture of me, right? You drive me crazy, says the target. That, of course, was a self-extracting RAR file, and it contained Dark Comet, which, as everyone knows, is obviously the most sophisticated piece of malware in the world, right? So changing our perspective a little bit, right? Here's the targeter's eye view of our operation, right? Looking at our victim. Obviously the webcam could be better centered on the target's face here. And then here's some OSINT that the operator is doing, trying to confirm another target, again based on webcam pics from this rat. What kind of information comes out of this haul? Well, this is a battle map. This was provided by a foreign security service to the Syrian opposition group that was hacked, right? Here's an actual battle plan that I've massively redacted that shows things like the location of every troop, what kind of guns they have, right, where they're going to attack before they attacked, right? Those little red things are hand-drawn berms, right, on a battlefield. Surveillance prior to a battle, right? So here they are monitoring their opposition with a telephoto lens. This totally redacted thing is a list of fighters along with their blood type, family members, parents' names. Really, like, it doesn't get deeper than that. So FireEye made this nice graphic at the time showing the different categories of information that were stolen. And this included sort of military stuff, political stuff, but also a big chunk of humanitarian material. Why is this relevant? Well, conflicts have a lot of human impact, and a lot of the groups that were trying to mitigate and blunt that awful human impact were among the most heavily targeted groups. So again, I make no apologies for the terrible font thing that happened, but the basic story here is that however you're doing it, right, a lot of players, especially in a conflict like that where they don't have the ability to go buy something, are going to do indirect or guerrilla SIGINT, right, and they're going to do it with rats and malware, right? And what they bring to it is quality deception, right? Not necessarily good tech. The issue is, whatever the root, harm is done. So we're going to talk really briefly about phishing as kind of the other thing that we see constantly.
Yeah, so we've been mostly talking about malware-based threats right now, so let's talk about phishing. So this is really the very bottom of the barrel, but if you think about this for an operator trying to target civil society, this might not be all that you need, because civil society is organizing, mobilizing, and communicating on popular consumer platforms like social networks, email, etc. So you don't necessarily need access to their computer network or even their device. If you own their online account, you own them, and you can get information about their activities that you need. So again, we've seen this happening all over the world. And why is this happening? Well, it's cheap, and it's easy, and it's effective. And again, the focus here is on social engineering. I'll briefly go through a few examples where we can see that the lures that are involved here, while this is, phishing, mundane, boring, technically simple, the lures are pretty sophisticated. So this is an example of a phishing email that we found in a campaign targeting Egyptian activists. In this case, in December of 2016, a prominent Egyptian lawyer was arrested. Within hours of her arrest, while she was still being interrogated at the police station, colleagues of hers at non-governmental organizations began to receive this email, which claims to share a document with details about her arrest warrant. Now, if you clicked on this, you would get this phishing page, which was pre-populated with the username. So highly specialized, highly targeted, and something that probably people would fall for in that kind of stressful situation. Here is another example. This is from a campaign we reported earlier in this year. This was sent to a Tibetan activist. It claims to share a logo for an official website of the Tibetan government in exile, which has been signed and approved by the Sikyong, which is a Tibetan word for president or prime minister. And it looks like it's sharing files, but they're actually links. So I'm sure everyone in the room can see that that link is a bit suspicious, but to your average user, they might not think about it and they click through. you would get this page, which looks like a Google login page, but of course is not. On one side of the screen here, you see the fake login page where there is all the prompts within one page. And of course now Google has changed their login to be a 2-prompt system. But again, if you're an activist and you're working quickly, you might not think about that. But the real clever part about this is the following trick. So once you put in your credentials and now you're owned, what happens is you are redirected to benign content on Google Drive. In this case, the very logo that was promised by the email. So, a clever deception to have the target not think that anything is wrong. So this is just a quick snapshot of this operation. It was active for over 19 months. And again, pretty simple, but they had a wide infrastructure that was being used. And we collected 58 decoy documents, such as the one I just showed you. And of those 58 documents, there are 11 different targeting themes. Obviously, Tibet was one of them, but there are other human rights groups that were targeted by this, and also governments and businesses across Asia. So these guys were pretty busy. Now, while we can't really estimate what the human cost is in terms of running this thing, we can estimate what the infrastructure cost was, and it was pretty cheap. So you could run this whole operation over that 19 months for just a little over $1,000 US. So, while what we've been showing you, again, is like the simplest thing that you can do, these operators are facing constant evolutionary pressures. Technology is changing, new security features are being added, and that causes them to pivot. So we've seen instances of two-factor hacking. We've also started to see malicious OAuth applications to get access to account credentials and other data from accounts. Don't have time to go into those details, but that's just to show when targets start changing defenses, when services start changing things within their platforms, these operators adapt to it. So with those examples and giving you kind of this high-level overview of what's happening with civil society, what can we all do in the room to make this better? So let's walk through the challenges and think through what possible responses could be.
All right, so obviously if you're in sort of the industry government space, maybe you approach some vendors, you talk to some experts, you're heavily targeted, nation-state actor going after you, right? Boy, is there an endpoint protection product for you. The same is not true if you're operating in civil society, right? It's kind of the ultimate where there is no IT department environment, as we said before. But that doesn't mean that people aren't trying things. A lot of what they're trying, though, looks like behavioral stuff, right? It looks like attempts to train people's behavior to get better. And this is attractive to a lot of people because the idea is like, well, maybe you can provide a training and then people will be less likely to click on things. The thing that we all know, right, is that information alone doesn't change behavior. It just doesn't work like that. And even in cases where behavior is successfully changed, there's kind of a deeper problem, which is it doesn't take very long for an operator to change a technique, but it takes a huge amount of time to change people's behavior, right? And the real talk is you can't patch basic human behavior. And it's reasonably trivial to change attacks and operations and deception just enough that it still kind of looks new, right? And if you don't believe me, look at the 2016 election and what's happened after that. So what do you guys do about it, right? Like we're in an industry conversation here. We've come to talk about civil society issues. Is there something you can do? Oh, definitely, right? We'll tell you what we think you can do. In some ways, it's a bit of a snooze to talk about boring rats and phishing, right? This is all stuff that we can nod along to. We can all talk about these behavioral things and bemoan the fact that, users are not going to change their behaviors. All of this is true, right? And if I say to you, you should spend more time researching boring threats, it's like, well, I don't understand what the financial incentive is for that. Like, my customers aren't interested, rada, rada. Fair enough. All those are reasonable points. I think that you could still do good work and exciting work while studying fairly boring threats. And I think the proof is in the pudding. Like, a lot of the cases where you read a report, often civil society targets are living somewhere in there, right? Often when you run an investigation, even if it's of something that looks like a state-owned state operation, there are going to be targets that don't have a big budget, that are somewhere in civil society, whether it's journalists or politicians or others. The problem is there's not always a lot of incentive on the vendor side to talk about those targets, or to talk about those targets in a way that I think is sophisticated or parsable to those potential targets. So my first plea to you would be give those targets extra attention and do it with a little bit of nuance and a little bit of context. The win there is that if you're communicating in a way that those target populations and the people working with them can understand, that information is at least going to be useful to people working with them, right? You can't necessarily change their behavior, but you can give them tools to help change theirs. It's remarkable that sometimes when we give presentations, we actually have to talk about reports that mention civil society targets, but that do almost no lift in terms of showing that those targets are at risk.
So if you've bought that, you're like, all right, I want to do something about this. How do I do it? Well, the first thing that you can do is think about some two-way partnerships with civil society, either directly or indirectly. And this can make a lot of sense from your perspective. Civil society groups are very targeted, therefore they're natural partners for getting good threat intelligence. But this is where you have to be careful, and you have to ensure that this is a fair relationship, and it has benefits both ways. And to do that, you need to build up trust, right? And trust is transactional, and it takes time. And it takes a very long time to build out, and you can lose it overnight. So treat civil society in the same way as an important client, or a sensitive case that you're doing, and make sure you understand what your strengths are, what you can do and what you can't do, what they can do and can't do, and have that be communicated up front and build out that relationship.
All right, obviously volunteering is something that you can do too. We get a lot of people who get in touch who say, hey man, I want to do something for the problem of the people, right? I want to help out. So obviously there are opportunities to engage as individuals and as organizations. Those may look different depending on where you sit and depending on the kinds of flexibility and resources that are available to you. Maybe it means working with intermediary groups. Maybe it means supporting researchers like us, right? Shameless promo, or others who are working on these cases. It may mean looking more towards volunteering, or it could mean providing direct product support to groups. We're happy to have these conversations with you if this is the kind of work that you're interested in doing. I think it's very scary often for people who are coming from industry to think about how you can engage. And so the question is like, man, would there be a lot of transaction costs? Would I even know how to talk with these people? Who's going to manage the relationship? And the answer is, there are approaches to addressing those things. You just may not be familiar with them. With that, we want to pivot to questions. The one thing I will flag, though, is Citizen Lab work is massively collaborative. We have a great team of people inside the lab who do good work, and then we have tons of people in industry and elsewhere who support and help us in our investigations, whether that means providing free or discounted product or tossing across threat intel. So with that, let's pivot to questions.
Unfortunately,